tracks, your little tank, and you're going around shooting bad guys around a maze type area. It's a top view, top down view. Ninja Boy, a platformer where you play this ninja. And I believe you're shooting stars with this one, but I'm not 100% sure about that. Quarterback Club, NFL Quarterback Club. It's basically a bunch of football-based mini games, and it was popular enough to warrant a sequel. Miner 2049er, based on a classic arcade game where you go around. It's kind of like Dig Dug a little bit, but you don't have to dig through dirt all the time. But you're going around, you're killing all the bad guys before they kill you. You're trying to find an exit. Battletoads, a platformer type fighter game that's really, really tough. Of course, Battletoads is famous for being a tough game. Fortified Zone, a top-down shooter where you're looking down from on top and you're using this guy. And it's kind of like Gauntlet, only with guns instead of swords. And it's modernized, of course. Panel action bingo. You're trying to claim more 5 panels before your opponent does. International Superstar Soccer. It's your soccer game. Wario Blast. This is a lot like Bomberman, only with Wario instead of Bomberman. And I think Bomberman might make a guest. Yep, featuring Bomberman. Yep, he makes a few appearances in there, I guess. Double Dragon 3, the arcade game. It's a fighter game. Dr. Franken. It's a platformer with spooky monsters in it. Snoopy's Magic Show. Basically, Snoopy is in this room full of tiles, and there are 4 copies of Woodstock in each corner, and there are obstacles on these tiles that Snoopy has to avoid, and Snoopy has to go and touch these 4 tiles to rescue these Woodstocks. And before, of course, the bad guys get him. So, there's that. It's a puzzle game, puzzle action game. Okay. Spider-Man and X-Men. That's a platformer starring the classic comic characters. Loops. Basically, it's this game where you've got a bunch of squares and they present you with a bunch of tetranimos or a bunch of tetranimo-like shapes, and what you have, or lines, and what you have to do is you have to connect some of them together to remove as many and make as many loops as you can to erase them, to get them off the board, so that you can keep the board from getting filled up. That's the main object, is to keep the board from filling up with loops that aren't matched. Great puzzle game. Frantic puzzle game. Daedalian Opus. And hopefully I pronounced that right, but it's a great puzzle game. What it is you're presented with a shape on the screen. It's kind of like the Tangrams game, where you got a bunch of shapes and you have to fill them, shape them, put them together to make certain animals. But this one's just basically boxy type characters, and they're presented with shapes. What you have to do is you have to put the shapes in the box to fill the box to go on to the next one. It's a pretty simple idea, but it's pretty tough to do. They're not easy. Double Dragon. DuckTales 2, a platformer of the adaptation to a sequel to the adaptation of the classic platformer game that critics seem to like. So I think the controls are kind of tough to handle myself, but here's a pretty interesting game. Flip Pool. What you have is this. You have to the left side of the board a bunch of different shapes, or a bunch of squares with different designs on them. And to the right, you have this thing that shoots squares with the same designs on them. What you have to do is you have to shoot the square on the right and hit the ones on the left to make them disappear. And the idea is to make them all disappear. And each of the rooms that they use are different shapes. They got different angles, and you have to shoot them in angles and whatnot. Or you have to shoot them somewhere on the ceiling to make them go down angles. But it's a pretty good game. Pretty fun puzzle game. That's where I started out. I started out getting all kinds of puzzle games because I was kind of a puzzle game snob. That's all I wanted to play. But then I started playing the action games and some of the RPGs. There aren't a lot of turn-based RPGs on the Game Boy, the original Game Boy, that I'm aware of. But there are a few that I've played. T2, the arcade game, basically you have a stylus and you move it around with the D-pad, the cursor, and you use the A button to shoot at certain targets. You got to shoot all the targets before, of course, they kill you. But it's a pretty fun game. There aren't a whole lot of games like this on the Game Boy, but it's pretty good. It's probably not as good as, of course, the arcade game where you got a gun, but it'll do. Super Battle Tank, first-person battle tank shooter. You're in a tank. It's not too elaborate. Ghostbusters 2, a top-down action game where you're playing one of the Ghostbusters. You capture ghosts and whatnot. Boxel. It's basically a game where you're in a bunch of rooms, where you're in a room with a bunch of boxes, and you have to manipulate and move the boxes to escape the room. That's pretty much it. But it's amazing how many puzzles they can make out of that. Just that one concept. Okay. Probably my favorite, one of my favorite games on the Game Boy. Metroid 2: Return of Samus. I like this game better than the original Metroid. The shooting is smooth. The movements are smooth. It's got that exploration on there. It's just a blast to play. An excellent, excellent, excellent shooter. I like the physics on the game better than most Game Boy games. Just if you like Metroid, you'll love this one. Maybe the graphics aren't the best, but they are pretty darn good graphics for the Game Boy. I think they're the best graphics I've ever seen on the Game Boy, personally, besides Donkey Kong Country or Donkey Kong Land, which I'll get to in a minute. Okay, Gremlins 2. It's basically a platformer where you're playing a Gizmo from Gremlins, and you're trying to avoid the other Gremlins. Final Fantasy Adventure, from the makers of Final Fantasy, only it's like more of like a Zelda game. then it's not an RPG type game. Or it's not an RPG, turn-based RPG. Yoshi, this is a puzzle game where Mario has 4 plates at the bottom of the screen, and you move Mario around, and you use him to swap 2 plates at a time. And each of these plates has a square on them, and each square has a design. And the idea is to, and you have pieces of egg that fall from the sky. And what Mario has to do is he has to catch the pieces, and he has to make sure that he doesn't let them stack too high by catching the bottom pieces of the eggs and then stacking them between the designs between them, and then getting the top part of the eggs whenever they randomly appear, putting them on top and making them disappear. So that's the idea besides for Yoshi. It's a puzzle game. But there's not a lot of Yoshi in it, I think. I think it's Mario that's doing all the work. Okay. The Adventures of Rocky and Bullwinkle and Friends. It's a rather awkward platforming game starring Bullwinkle the Moose. Kid Icarus of Myths and Monsters. You're playing Kid Icarus, doing Kid Icarus type things. Bomberman for the Game Boy. Donkey Kong for the Game Boy. Some say that it's the best adaptation of a Donkey Kong that was ever made. So I've always found Donkey Kong to be kind of tough. Gargoyles, a platformer where you're a gargoyle and you can fly in some places. My very first Game Boy game, and one that has kept me awake for hours and hours, Tetris. I was playing so much this at one time that I'd be sitting around and I would have nothing but Tetris in my head. But it's a very fun game. I remember the first night I had Tetris. That went by so fast, it was insane. But there's that. It actually came. That was back when consoles came with a free game, kind of like bundles they have now. But they don't do that no more unless they're a bundle. And